Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kelly Valmore from the PLC. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar for the RSE task, RSETS, on specially designed instruction and explicit instruction presented by Dee Berlinghoff. And this is actually a repeat of a webinar that was done on March 20th. And there are just a few housekeeping issues that I want to go over with you before we begin. What Dee and I discussed and we have decided is that as Dee goes through her presentation this afternoon, she will be pausing after key topics to take questions. And we are a small group this afternoon, so we've decided that if you do have a question, that it would be appropriate to just speak up on the phone. And if that does not work, we will take questions via the chat. You can certainly enter questions into there, and you can raise your hand as well. But we're going to try to just ask questions over the phone. The other thing that I'd like you to know is that if you would like to mute your line, it is *6. And then to unmute your line, it is *6. And so you don't have to do that right now. It doesn't seem like we're having any interference, but if you do hear some interference, that might be something that you could do. Again, it's *6 line and *6 to unmute your line. So I just want to do a quick roll call to make sure that the folks that I see on the line can actually hear what's happening and they're able to see their screen. So when I call your name, if you could just let me know if you are able to see your screen and if you are, in fact, able to hear me. And we will start with Sophie.
Here.
Okay, thank you. And Alyssa?
Thanks, good.
Okay, and Kristen?
Good.
Thank you. And Nicole?
All good.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
All good.
Thank you. And Marie?
All good.
And Allison?
Afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for joining us, and I am going to turn this webinar over to Dee.
So, good afternoon. I'm glad to be back. I know this isn't with everyone, but I'm glad to be back. Everyone should have a copy of the presentation, right, Kelly?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, good. So I'll go ahead and get started, and I will take, there are natural break points at the end of every topic, and I'll make sure to stop there for you to have questions, ask questions or comments. And I cannot, if you do raise your hand on the screen, I can't see it. All I can see on my screen is the presentation. But Kelly can see your hands raised, or she can see if you type in questions. But I can, since there are so few of us, I can take your questions right over the phone when we get to those points. Okay, so I took all of the questions way back in February when Kelly and I talked about the questions that were important to your group. We sort of whittled those questions down into typical areas, and then I looked further at the questions and I said kind of what were the big ideas in your question areas. And one of the big topics was, what does instruction look like? And it seemed like there were focus area questions. So what I did was I sort of grouped the questions. So we'll talk about the questions, and then I'll go on to what I thought some responses could be. So one of the focus areas of your questions were, what does instruction look like in multi-grade special class, including choice of modules, how do you choose modules that could lessons from the Common Core Learning Standards, remembering that a multi-age classroom potentially has students from 3 different grade levels in one class, and then where should you focus your instruction if you have grades 3, 4, and 5 in an 8-1-1 setting? You know, do I teach the 4th grade? Do I teach the 5th grade? How do I differentiate? And I will talk about that a little bit because I think this is a whole new group, to explain what I did last year, not this current academic year, the previous academic year. I was on sabbatical, so I did not work at Mount St. Mary College. I worked in a K-8 building in Newburgh, and it's one of the schools identified as being in need of assistance, and they received a School Innovation Fund grant. And part of what I did was work with teachers on effective instructional methods. So I did spend a fair amount of time working with self-contained teachers and addressing that very question. So my response was, and we did a lot of this last year, was to first look at common skills. If I know that I have 3 grade levels, what should I do across those grade levels? There are common skills like vocabulary. I know that I have to teach vocabulary, and it doesn't really matter whether I'm teaching 1st grade or 3rd grade or 10th grade. I always have to teach vocabulary. If you're working with teachers or you're working with administrators and they're using the modules, and it doesn't matter if they're using the ELA modules or the math modules, the vocabulary that needs to be taught or that's been identified as important is it's already in the module. It's identified in the lesson. One thing that's really important for the math is that there are vocabulary terms that are listed in the modules, and the definitions that are in the modules may not match the PK8 glossary that has been published by the State Ed Department. And I know the C&I people in math, the preference, the direction is that you need to use the PK8 glossary. That's where the definitions, that if you're going to teach vocabulary, those are the definitions that they want you to use. So that's my advice if you're working with teachers in classrooms. Where do I get math definitions? I go to that PK8 glossary for math. There are also other common skills like the gist and close reading. I was just talking with some teachers about annotating. Those are all very common, so I look at those common threads and I teach those first. You also would look for a theme. So across the grades, and I know this because I've spent a lot of time working in the modules, I know that there's a lot of I wonder and I notice. So I start in the very first module. Right now we're at the end of the year, but I know that if I'm going to work in a 3rd grade or an 8th grade class where I'm working with teachers of those classes or I'm working with administrators, I say I teach that skill or I teach those things right from the very first module of the year because I know they're common across grades. And if I teach that right from the beginning, the rest of the year is easy and it goes across the grade levels. I know in 6th grade I can look for the theme, and that theme is Hero's Journey. And if I read Lightning Thief, that's great. But Hero's Journey is the theme. And if I look in the list of reading and I look at the Lexile books, I can find other books that also have those tool skills that are in the modules or in the Common Core Learning Standards, and I can work on those tool skills looking at where are my students and where do they need to be. In math, and this is key across all the grade levels, so it doesn't matter what grade level I'm teaching, I need to pick a problem-solving strategy. And I identified 3rd grade because this is where my mind was in March, and my mind is still there now, so it didn't change. It doesn't matter what grade you're teaching. Pick a problem-solving strategy. RDW is in the modules, and it's very consistent across all of them. It's a problem-solving strategy. I teach it explicitly, and I teach it to all of my students. So it doesn't matter if they're in 2nd grade or 3rd grade or 6th grade. I actually had someone say to me a couple of weeks ago, well, would you teach it in 1st grade? And the answer is yes, you would teach it in 1st grade. I actually was working with a 1st grade teacher who said, I wish I had had this all year. if I had this all year, my students might be able to write a sentence to tell how they got their answer. So using that across the grade levels and just looking at what's consistent. And then in writing, and I know this is something I talked about with the last group, explicitly teach a writing strategy that's step by step. And that's something that goes across all the grade levels, is teaching one strategy, teaching it to all the students. So even if I have third, fourth, and fifth graders, I pick a writing strategy and I teach it to all of the students. What they're writing about might be different, but they all know the same strategy. And one of the things we talked about with the last group is if I had to pinpoint, and I think this comes up later in our talk, if I have to pinpoint or prioritize a strategy to teach or prioritize a skill for the year, I would prioritize writing, because I know if my students get better at writing, they'll get better at reading. So that's just my little editorial comment for now. Continuing along, what does instruction look like? For student focus or for looking at students in more restrictive settings, obviously you need to look at their strengths and their skill developments, and then look at the grade level expectations and look at the IEP. All of that being said, an IEP is not a magic wand and an IEP is not a magic carpet. We still have to use explicit instruction, because nowhere in an IEP does it really say, do this explicitly. It talks about services and it talks about a bunch of things, but it doesn't really talk about how you should maybe do something. What we need to keep thinking about is bridging the gap and where are the students. And what I always talk about when I'm working with teachers or administrators, because very often I have administrators say to me, you don't understand, I have fourth graders and they have to pass the test. And I say, I understand you have fourth graders who have to pass the test, but you have fourth graders reading on a first grade level and they can't infer if they can't read the passage. So we have to work on some basic reading skills before we can talk about inference. So we have to meet students where they are, and we have to get them to do some reading, actual reading, before we can teach them about inference. So the last bullet then is we can't look at teaching everything. We have to talk about setting priorities, and that is the hard conversation that you have with people, and it's sometimes sitting down and saying, okay, what's the first thing we teach? What's the second thing we teach? And I know that's the conversation people don't like to have, but it's what's number one. Is number one actually getting a student to read words? So I was actually just in a classroom yesterday, and I said, look, right now you have to teach some sight words, because if this student can't read the word A, which is the letter A, I said, if the student can't read that, I don't know how much further you're going to get. You need to do some very systematic basic instruction so we can move along with some other things. We will also talk about word families and we'll talk about some other things, but we have to get some basic instruction settled before we can move on to more advanced kinds of skills. Kelly, can you see the next slide, and can you tell me if I'm at the end of topic one? Because I'm afraid if I go forward, I'll mess up the presentation.
I don't have it in front of me. I would just move to the next slide, and if you need to go back.
Okay, I'm at top.
That,
all right. So does anybody have any questions or comments, or something I said didn't make sense, or about modules, Common Core Learning Standards? This group is very quiet. No questions? Okay. So, which standards do you pick? So this kind of piggybacks on what I just said. There are so many, and you can't possibly teach everything. And I know you're working in schools where you're having people say, well, I have to teach everything. And I say you can't teach everything. So you have to prioritize. Goes back to which ones do I pick. Students are struggling, and teachers are struggling with, do I work on the student's grade level standards or the instructional grade level standards? So this is where, and I know you've talked about this before, but look at the gap analysis and you say, okay, my student, I have a 6th grade student who's reading on a 1st grade reading level and can't even read sight words or is reading basic sight words but has no reading comprehension. What should I do? This is where you have a conversation about, we can't even talk about reading comprehension unless we start focusing on teaching some sight words and some word families and maybe some decoding by analogy and maybe some listening comprehension, and getting the student to understand that, wow, what I hear, and I can talk about what I hear in a story, or I can talk about what I hear in social studies and talk about it, and I can do reciprocal teaching. Does everybody know reciprocal teaching? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay, good. So I can use reciprocal teaching for listening comprehension. So I've used it in the upper grades with essentially non-readers, and we still can talk about what we've read, and I can still assess reading comprehension. And then what I do is I start making the reading harder and harder. So last year when I was on sabbatical, I had students, I was working with bilingual students, I was working with general ed students, I was working with students in self-contained, and we were working on reading comprehension, writing, and the whole big thing. I was taking articles to read to 5th grade students. I was taking articles that were on a 9th grade level, so they were clearly above their reading level, but I started with, I know this article is way too hard, so we're going to read it together. We're going to learn some really fancy vocabulary words so that you can impress everybody with the words you know, and you're going to you're going to be so smart, and everybody will be impressed. What was amazing was even the students who were in the bilingual class, they remembered the words, they used them correctly, and when we put out the challenge, this is hard, this is challenging, they all rose to the challenge. So part of it is, this is going to be hard, but I know you can do it. That's part of that bridging the gap. And then I'll say this 500,000 times because I can't say it enough. And this is what I say to teachers all the time. If you're going to bridge the gap, and it doesn't matter if it's a general ed run-of-the-mill student, it doesn't matter if it's a student who is an English language learner, it doesn't matter if it's a student with any kind of disability, you really need to explicitly teach vocabulary every single day. And I tell my students, I tell teachers, that is the number one way to start bridging the gap, because one of the reasons students aren't getting reading comprehension and they're not writing is because they don't have enough words in their backpacks. They just have words to bring to the front of their heads to be able to write about. So teachers are even reading aloud to them, but teachers are reading words that they don't know. And these are students who are not going to raise their hands and say, I don't know what you just said. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And everybody has the Archer and Hughes text, right?
Yes.
Yes. So if I said, go look at Chapter 3, refresh yourself, every time you go into school, make sure you talk about Archer and Hughes explicit instruction, and if you can get people doing that every single day, you can move leaps and bounds in a year just by teaching students words. We saw that in a week of a summer school just by teaching 3 new words every single day to pre-K and K students. Students remembered 15 words and could use 15 words at the end of a week. So we know that it works. So I'll stop because now I'm on topic 3. Any questions?
So, Liz, I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have a resource on some of those overarching strategies, and this kind of goes back to topic 1, too. I know you mentioned some of the strategies that are in the modules, but do you have like a text resource that you would say these are the most effective strategies for students to be able to fill in that gap? Would you say there is a resource or a few that you would recommend?
There are. And I can't remember, I need to, and if I did not reference it in this PowerPoint, I will send it to Kelly, and then she can forward it.
Perfect.
Certainly the vocabulary, the explicit instruction, that is one of them that if I could say this 10,000 ways and do cartwheels. If people would do that every single day, and I've seen it in practice, if you can just get people to even teach 3 words a day, it makes such a difference. There is also a strategy instruction text that you may or may not have. Reed Ortiz Lineman and and they've revised the second edition so much better than the first edition. In the second edition, they have actually included, so the first edition they said, this is strategy instruction, blah, blah, blah. This is how you do it. In the second edition, they actually included some really nice strategies, and they actually wrote out the lesson plans.
Oh, okay.
With the Think Aloud. So I like the second edition so much better. I actually used parts of the second edition in my class this spring. And it made it so much clearer to my students because it actually had everything the teacher would say, and I could see light bulbs going on in people's heads. Like,
I'm sorry, could you repeat the name of that book?
Yes, it's called Strategy Instruction, and of course, I'll bet you I have like 5 copies.
Oh, okay.
And I bet they're all at home on my desk. Oh no, I have one. It is called Strategy Instruction for Students with Learning Disabilities. Okay. And Guilford Press is the publisher.
All right. I think we actually may have it. I'm not sure. Okay.
You may have it.
The third edition is the good one?
No, it's the second edition. I don't
edition.
know what I was thinking. The second edition is so much better because and the reason I like using it with teachers is it really scripts out the lessons and they can see what a Think Aloud looks like. And sometimes what happens is people will roll their eyes at you, and I'm sure you've seen this, and they've done it to me. So they'll roll their eyes at me. They're like, "You can't really mean that." And I say, "Yes, that's what I mean." And last year when I was doing lots of Think Alouds in classrooms, it was very obvious, and I'm not saying that none of these students ever had Think Alouds in their lives, but going through the entire process of thinking aloud and making mistakes and saying out loud, "Oh, it's okay to make a mistake. I'll just come back to that." Or, "I don't know that answer. That's okay." Like having somebody say that out loud and hearing an adult say it was very eye-opening, I think, for some of the students because I could tell by their faces they were looking at, first of all, some of them, their jaws dropped to the floor, and I could see their brains processing, 8th graders, and they're looking at me, and I could see their brains processing sort of like, "Oh my gosh, you can make a mistake. People make mistakes. Oh my goodness." And the one girl, I could tell she was looking at me like I had 3 heads, but I could tell what her brain was thinking is, "Oh my gosh, people make mistakes. You can leave something blank, and that's okay." I was doing a whole model for high school 11th grade U.S. history, and I went from the graphic organizer. I had done that with them, and then I said, "Okay, now I'm going to show you how you write a paragraph from this." So I said, "Okay," and I'm thinking, so now the next thing I need to do is I need to look in the first box because that will be my first sentence. So I see in this box it says, "So now I'm going to write," and then I wrote the sentence, and this girl just blurts out, "Oh my goodness, is that how you do that?" And this was in 11th grade. And I said, I said to the teachers afterwards, "I have no doubt that somebody has modeled this, but it took a real explicit lesson for this 11th grader to get it." And they said, we couldn't believe that someone in 11th grade. I said, "That's why you think aloud. Because you can't assume just because somebody made it to 11th grade that somebody knows how to do it." And I am going to show you at some point the IRIS modules at the Vanderbilt Center, if you're not familiar with those. I know some of you may be and some of you might not be. I use those. I've started using those a lot with my students. And if you just Google IRIS Vanderbilt, you will come to their website. There are modules and tutorials and case studies, and they're fabulous. just about anything you wanted to learn about: strategies, behavior management, RTI, evidence-based practices, anything. Any more questions? No? Okay. So this next topic is the one I think that gives people a lot of squeamishness, especially as we just got past April. Instructional level versus grade level. And I know that, I will throw myself under the bus. I get into a lot of debates with people over this because we know for students with disabilities, especially students who struggle with reading and writing, there is very often a huge gap between their performance level and the grade level expectations. So the question was, what are some explicit instruction strategies that teachers can use to expose students to the grade level expectation and that then yet work from the performance level while slowly or rapidly bringing students closer to the grade level expectations? So my first response is the same as above. You have to do the gap analysis. And this is where you have to have those hard conversations with people about, you really have to talk about doing curriculum-based measurement, and you have to talk about doing writing assessments. And I'm not talking about doing state tests. I'm talking about doing writing samples and doing 3-minute writing samples and doing 1-minute read alouds and doing sight word lists and doing all of those things that do take a little bit of time, but they help you figure out where is this student reading, and then putting that data on a graph and making decisions about where is this student in reference to his or her peers, where is this student in reference to what is the gap analysis, and then making a priority list. If I know the 5th grade requirement is that the student has to write a 3-paragraph essay, and I know that the student can't write a sentence, I need to figure out how am I going to get from sentence to 3-paragraph essay, and I need to know that that is, in fact, the gap. And if the essay the student has to write is an opinion essay and the student doesn't even know what an opinion is, I know that I have to teach the vocabulary word opinion versus fact. So I really have to look at my gap. And then I need to look back in the prior year standards. And I need to say, okay, well, this is what they did in 4th grade. All right, that's how they built on it. This is what they did in 3rd grade. Because if I look back carefully, I can very often find the lessons or what I need to teach that's already there and has already been done for me. And this is, I say this to people all the time, just because a student has been taught something doesn't mean the student has learned it. So that doesn't stop me from going back and looking at those things and figuring out a way that I can teach it maybe more explicitly, differently explicitly, with a different strategy. I need to look back and see what the prerequisite knowledge is, and I need to build a lesson to make it work. The standards get increasingly complex, so going back through the standards ensures that I'm working on the same skill set. I don't want to go off the ranch. I need to stay on the ranch, and if I go back in a linear fashion, I can be looking at, okay, if this is the 5th grade skill set for writing, and I go back straight through the standards, I'm still working on the same skill set, and then I can guarantee myself that I'm at least working on the same things. I put a link in the ELA for Core Knowledge. They did the domains for grades K through 2, the ELA domains. What they have done, and this is free, teachers don't have to pay for this, so grades 3 through 5, they have now made available, so you can go to this link, and then you can click, they have free files that work on the basic skills, things like phonics and phonemic awareness. So just because a student has made it to 3rd grade or 4th grade or 5th grade doesn't mean that the student doesn't need to still work on these things. They have free downloads for lessons that work on phonics, phonemic awareness, word study, all of those things. K through 5, a teacher can go and download, and then all of the lessons and activities are there, and they support all of those skill developments. So if I'm a teacher in third grade and I get a student who still hasn't developed phonemic awareness, I can go to core knowledge and I can look at those lessons. My student still hasn't developed the second grade skills, I can go back and get the second grade skill set lessons. Does that make sense? Yes? So
Yes.
I've been using this in the schools where I've been working, where I get fifth grade teachers who say, my student is still working on some second grade things. I'm a fifth grade teacher. I don't even know where to get that stuff. I say, well, here is where you can go. It's easy to get it. Your student should not be working on this all day. This is a subset. This is what you can do during your RTI block. Your student needs to be working on some. And we talk about other students can be working on. Theoretically, for ELA and math, for fall 2015, there will be scaffolds for students with disabilities available on Engage New York. A consortium, I'm part of the consortium. There's a person from Oneonta, a person from Geneseo, and a person from Penn State. We got the RFP to write the scaffolds for students with disabilities, and those scaffolds will accompany the modules. So we're in the process of writing those scaffolds and submitting them to the C&I team for review. So hopefully they will be available on Engage New York in the fall. And the ELA and I have math grades 1 through 5, and I have ELA grades 3 through 8. Anne-Marie Urso has high school. She's from Geneseo. She has high school ELA. And Paul Riccomini from Penn State has grades 6 through whatever was finished by December 1st, whatever was posted on Engage New York by December 1st, 2014, math. So it's something, algebra, something. He's doing those scaffolds. And the way they're set up is so that math will have fluency scaffolds, and there will be scaffolds for application problems, and there will be scaffolds for concept development and concepts for the scaffolds for the problem sets and the homework. And then they'll be consistent through the grade levels. And then in ELA, there will be scaffolds for vocabulary, metacognitive strategy instruction, writing, and then kind of miscellaneous. And that's where we've put things like Freyer cards. So does anybody have any questions before I go on? No?
No.
No? Kelly, no?
I think we're good, Dee.
Think we're good? Okay. So, what about perseverance? Interestingly, I just saw this. I can't remember which module I was reading. Might have been 8th grade, ELA. This is really a big issue, this perseverance piece. And it's a big issue for, and I need to say this out loud, this is an issue not only for students with disabilities. I hear this when I go into schools and I'm working with first graders, and I hear it when I go work with teachers of high school students. So I hear it everywhere. I'd even say it's an issue at the college level. So I don't think, I know that you're hearing it when you're in schools working with people, but I don't think it's confined to students with disabilities or, teachers working with students with disabilities. And is it an appropriate skill to address as an annual goal as being vital? Yes, because one of the things we know when we go get a job, we have to be able to persevere. Last year, one of the things we identified when I was on sabbatical, and we identified it in the lower grades and we identified it in the upper grades. And we actually identified it when we were doing, and I really don't like to use this word, but I'll use it anyway, when we were doing test prep. One of the things we found was that, especially in ELA, the rigor of the tasks really required students to have a lot of reading stamina, and they really needed the ability to stick with a reading task for a long time. And we found that our students just didn't have the perseverance, they didn't have the stamina to stick with it for longer than 5 minutes. So we really started working on how were we going to do this. So we started talking about, well, some of it depends on what grade level you're working with. Some of it depends on, is it a student who's not been reading English for a very long time? What is the disability of the student? We need to look at a whole bunch of different factors. And then we looked at how were we going to scaffold it, because we weren't going to say to students, well, you can only read for 5, right now, your task, you can stick with it for 5 minutes. Well, tomorrow you're going to read for 30 minutes, and too bad, so sad, stick it out. We know that these are students who have typically been very unsuccessful, and they don't like reading, they don't like writing, they don't like math, they don't find it reinforcing. It's aversive. So we need to find ways to find it more fun. You need to make it more fun. So one of the things we did was we came up with this kind of check chart, how can I basically make more reading fun. So, certainly for younger students, we talked about I'm not there yet, I'm almost there, and I got it. So not yet is the frowny face. Almost there was the, semi-smiling face, and then I got it, woohoo. I stayed in my reading spot. There are some teachers who really like students, if I gave you a place to sit and read, that's where you need to sit and read. So working, that was really important to them. So that had to be on their checklist. Read silently or in a whisper voice. That was teacher dependent. Read the whole time. Stick with my book until I finish it. And that we altered depending on the grade level, because certainly there were some first graders who, they were reading whole books, and they did a different checklist. They kind of did one every single time. There were other students, we changed it to finish the section until I finish it, stick with the chapter until I finish it, and then use my reading strategies. Related to that, we had other students who had another checklist. So I had teachers who were doing reading strategies like DRTA, which is Directed Reading Thinking Activity, which is a prediction strategy. So their students had a checklist for that. So they also had a checklist for, did I make a prediction? Was my prediction based on evidence? Did I find evidence for my prediction? Did I write evidence for the prediction? So some students had 2 checklists going at the same time. But that was a way that we worked on perseverance. And then there were other students. As I said, I spent a lot of time in one of the self-contained classes, and there were students who had minimal perseverance. So we really tied that into the behavior management system. And it was a very concrete, it went back to, so it really left the realm of academic instruction, and it went into the realm of the things that you learn in behavior management. And so we essentially set up token economies, so that students could, they were earning points, and they were earning, check marks, and they were earning those kinds of things so that they could exchange those things for, and last year it's when those little, those little bracelets, I can't think of the name, the rainbow bracelets, whatever, those weavy bracelets. I can't think of the name. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? Or am I not making any sense? Anyway, they wanted to make these little bracelets, and they could earn so many little bracelet things to make their bracelets.
Little rubber bands, yes.
The little rubber band bracelets, yes. Mm-hmm. I finally got the word out. And kind of that's how we got them to stick with their reading. And, we had to use that because there were kids who were concrete. I can say I've been back in that class this year, and for the students who are still in there, and somebody finally did take my advice, and it's not a multi-age class this year. So they do have a little more stick-to-itiveness, and the teacher has not had to go to those lengths this year of having such a, she hasn't had to go to token economy. But that's kind of, that was the level the students were working on last year, so that's where we were. Are there any questions about that, about the stick-to-itiveness, the perseverance?
This is Alyssa again. I sent a little message to the room. Do you have any research that could be cited behind it? So when I heard you say, would I use that as an annual goal, I completely agree as a skill. Are there lists of some research of here are the most common deficit skills that we see? Especially I liked when you said going into college, even for gen ed, when people, rather than just picking something they think a student might need, at least if they're going to randomly pick something, it'd be nice to give them some research around here are your probable skills that these students are going to deal with at some point in their life.
Honestly, I would, and I know we're not there yet, one of the places I would look, I would go to the CDOS.
Yep, okay.
Document.
That's what we use, yep.
And that's where I would look, and I would say, okay, and I'll talk about this when I get there, but I did a little survey because I was trying to figure out, are people using the CDOS, and I had the range from, I had university and college people were like, I don't even know what you're talking about, to, thank goodness, the public school people were like, yes, we're using it, and, we use it in our IEPs, and I'm like, thank goodness. But that's what I would use, because when I look at the CDOS, I'm like, well, I wish some people used that. I wish general ed people used that, because if they did, and people kind of had a checklist, if guidance counselors had a checklist and went through it and said, check, our students leave our high school being able to do this, check. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep, and we talk about using CDOS because we know that it fills into everything. I just didn't know if you had any other specific cited research.
I can find some, and this is kind of, when I look at some of the post-secondary research, what you find is that it's very targeted by disability. Mm-hmm. So you'll find that, students with learning disabilities get these kinds of services, and it really depends on how competent the special education teachers are at the secondary level and how well the guidance counselors advocate. So if it isn't a good guidance department, they just don't end up with what they need, or if people aren't really looking out, or if they have parents who don't advocate for their needs. Right. And that's the evidence. So it really comes down to the teachers really just having to stand up and say, this is how it is. So there was a teacher lamenting a couple of weeks ago about parents not being involved, and I said, that's the way it is in this school. Your job is to be the advocate for those students. Your job is to make sure they get what they need in their IEPs. So, and I'm sure that's already what you're preaching, but you can't say it enough, and then just use the CDOS as this is what we're going to use, and we're putting this in the IEP, and that's that.
Thank you.
So, any more questions or comments, or you're crazy? I've heard that before, so I don't get it.
We're all crazy with you. You're fine.
Okay, so we're all on the same boat, I guess.
Yep.
Someone told me I was driving the bus. That's okay. Someone told me I was driving the bus yesterday, but that's all right. So I don't care. I have lots of friends on it with me, and I don't care. So, are there case studies? Interestingly, I almost laughed out loud when somebody said this to me yesterday. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm doing a webinar on Thursday, and I know these people have this question. Case studies are so hard to come by because it's very hard to get that information, because obviously it's protected information in schools. So my colleagues and I are actually trying to gather some case studies. So when we gather those, and that's part of what we're trying to do this summer, when I gather those up, I will make those available to Kelly, and then Kelly, you may feel free to distribute those as you wish.
Absolutely.
Is that okay? It's very hard for us to get them from schools because obviously schools need to protect the confidentiality of their students. But we finally put our heads together the other day and decided that we have enough piecemeal information and can protect children and can protect schools, that we have had enough assignments that our students have done that we think we can pull some things together, and no one will, we think we can pull enough together that we can use it in our courses. And I think it would be okay for me to share that with you, Kelly, because I can, we can change everything that needs to be changed. And I think that would be able to help you. And the IEP form that we always use is the one that is on the state ed website. I'm assuming that's the one that I know a lot of schools use IEP Direct, but that goes along with the one that's on the state ed website anyway. Is that good?
Yep.
Is that good? Okay. All right. So, and my short answer, this is that would be a semester-long course, looking at specially designed instruction. So the whole, how do I design instruction? We actually, at the graduate level, the IEP course is one whole semester. The methods course for how do I design instruction, how do I design specially designed instruction, at the graduate level, that's 2 courses. So you're getting in, a couple of hours what normally takes me 30 weeks to teach. So I'm giving you the very nutshell version. When I require my students to write goals, I require them to copy and paste them straight out of the standards documents. So they are not allowed to make them up. They're not allowed to pull them out of their heads. They actually have to go into the standards document and they have to copy it straight out of there. And then they have to reference it, by number. Where did they get it? So all of their instruction has be directly linked to the standards. So it doesn't matter whether they're using Common Core Learning Standards or CDOS. It doesn't matter what they're doing. It has to be directly related to the standards. And I already said that they do the IEPs directly from the form on state ed. And we do expose students to this, the SDI lesson plan format. We refer them to the Common Core template. We have our own explicit instruction template that's based on Archer and Hughes. We have had to add some components, and that's really because of the certification requirements with the EdTPA, the videotaping piece. There are just some things that we have to familiarize them with, and then there are some things with our national accreditation. So there are additional pieces to what's on that SDI lesson plan format that we require that they wouldn't have to do for that. But the whole, how do we get students to do that, or how do you get people to do that? If you would like me to send you some lesson plans or even our lesson plan template, I can send that to Kelly. And I can send you some completed lesson plans. I can tell you right now, you will probably look at them and you'll say, crazy, nobody writes lesson plans like that. That's completely mind-bogglingly insane. Nobody does that in the real world. And I know that. But my job.
A teacher say that to me the other day. You're absolutely right, Dee.
They say that all the time. And
they don't do lesson plans like that.
They don't do lesson plans like that. But I say if more teachers did lesson plans like this, maybe we'd have good first teaching. So I say that in my little way. But I say, what I say to my students is, well, you're not a teacher, so you have to do it my way, and you have to show me you can think. And once you show me you can think, then you're good to go. But part of it, and what I say to them is, if you can think through the process and you understand how to think through it, and you can do all of your lessons like this, it works. And I tell them, listen, I told all of my students this story this semester. So when I was on sabbatical last year, I was a crazy woman. I wrote out all of my lesson plans. I wrote out everything. I made my posters, and then I wrote out lesson plans, some of them handwritten, most of them typed. But every time I went into a class, I had a lesson plan typed out. I'd go in with written out lesson plans. So all well and good, da-da-da. So one of the teachers moved to another building, and she wanted me to come meet with her so we could go over some things. I went over it with her, and she said to me, do you know what I noticed last year? And it didn't make any sense. She said, every time you came into my class to do a lesson, you had a written lesson plan. I said, mm-hmm. She said, I thought about that because I was having so much trouble teaching this math. I was having so much trouble. And then I thought about you and your written lesson plan. So I went home and I started writing out the lesson plans. I said, and then what happened? She said, my lessons are so much better. I said, why do you think that is? She said, because I really started thinking through everything, and once I started writing it down, I could see where the kids were having problems, and it made a lot more sense to me. So this is an experienced teacher. So there is some benefit to having people write it out. When you're working with people, if you can get them to write out even one lesson, even on that template, the Common Core guidance template, just one lesson. I had a whole middle school of people, co-teachers. I had them writing them out, and they did say it made a difference. Of course, they were the people who signed up to do co-teaching. So, but anyway, are there any questions about that? While you're saying she's crazy about writing out lesson plans. This is case studies. If in the absence of case studies, the other advice I have is, as you're working in a district, grab an IEP, write out the name, and just say, let's look at this. Let's look at this student. What can we do with this student? The other piece of advice is go to the IRIS modules that we will look at, and they have case studies. Any questions, since I interrupted myself? Any questions about the case studies? All right.
This is Kathy. I just want to interrupt for 1 second and remind people to mute their lines, especially if there's background noise surrounding them, because we are getting some background noise. Thank you.
Okay, so topic 6. How do the CDOS standards integrate with the Common Core Learning Standards? So the key point to get across is that they need to be interwoven, and don't look at them as two separate things. So I think everybody has this, and from what I gathered from the previous group in March is that either all or some of you have seen a document like this. I made up a matrix because sometimes in my head this is how I think through things. So if I'm working with teachers and somebody said to me, well, I don't understand, how do they go together? I would work with a matrix, and I would say, well, they go together like this. If I'm working on a lesson plan and I'm working with 9th grade and I know that I need to work in reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and I am working at commencement level, because by 9th grade, I'm thinking about commencement. If I'm a high school teacher, I'm looking at the end. So I look at ELA 9, and I know in ELA 9 and 10, students need to be able to cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what a text says explicitly as well as inferences drawn. So then I go look at the CDOS and what lines up with that, and it says use insight. So insight and inferences and generalizations, those things go together? Does that take a few minutes? Do you have to sit and have both documents open? Yes, you do. It takes sitting and doing those things and actually being thorough about it and being purposeful. Did you have experience or have you used a matrix like this before?
That in the NISA, this is Marie, I know that in the NISA there's a crosswalk between the CDOS and the skills, which is, a similar process.
Okay, good. So you have something like this to help you do it. I think, so my real answer is when people say, well, how do they integrate? Part of it is just sitting and doing the process with people, because what I'm hearing when I've talked to people and I've started asking mostly the high school people questions, what are you doing about it? I'm getting kind of either or answers. I'm getting, well, we do the CDOS and the Common Core Learning Standards, and I'm saying, well, what are you doing about the both? And they say, well, and I'm saying, no, you need to do both. And then I have had some really good people say to me, well, of course we do both. What would you expect? Of course, one of those people was one of my former students, and I would hope she would say that to me. But, and it seems, so this is just my perception, so you can, the people who are saying, of course we would do both, are people who are working in co-teaching. The people who are saying, well, I do the CDOS, are people who are in self-contained. And then the people who are, well, we just do Common Core Learning Standards, are some of the co-teaching pairs, so in those settings. So I think, I'm not sure if this was what your question was getting at, but some of it is, even if there is a crosswalk, there are some people who need they need to sit down and they need a concrete, this is the CDOS, this is the Common Core Learning Standards, let's see how they meet, and they need actual physical paper, and they need somebody to sit with them and say, this is how they go together, and yes, you have to use both of them, and yes, both of them have to be on the IEP, and yes, both of them have to be there. I was in a district and I asked a question about the CDOS and the Common Core Learning Standards, and someone said to me, we don't look at the CDOS until the student has failed all of the Regents exams. And my eyeballs almost popped out of my head. And I said, can you tell me a little more about that? And the person repeated what he said. He said, I said, oh, okay, because I really didn't have an answer to that. I said, well, I'm wondering if we could maybe look at it a little bit sooner. And, that's something I have to take up with someone else in the district. But, one of the things is doing that concrete paper walk and getting people to see it before 12th grade, or 11th grade, before the student has failed all of the Regents exams. And also, because I've been really trying to ask a lot of questions about this since the March webinar, trying to bring parents into it and making parents part of that IEP process. Not that parents aren't, but really trying to get them to understand the CDOS standards. Does that make sense? And doing the crosswalk with parents? Does that make sense? Yes.
Yes, it does.
Yes. Okay, good.
Yes.
All right. Use of protocols for guided practice. So this will actually, this is really strategy instruction and teaching students to be organized. We know it just isn't an area of strength. Archer and Hughes, chapter 6 through 8, provides lots of information on that. Those chapters, so I'm sure you've already read them, but this might be a good time to go back and refresh yourself and say, okay, what goes on in guided practice? And this is a good place to start with teachers. So besides vocabulary instruction, the next place is corrective feedback, because when you go into classrooms and you do observations or you do a walkthrough, one of the things that's probably missing is good corrective feedback. You're probably missing error correction. You're probably missing wait time. You're probably missing specific praise. You're probably missing all of those things. That is what really needs to go into how do we have good, specially designed instruction? How do we improve executive function skills? How do we focus? How do we put that all into one package? One of it is to have good corrective feedback, and then marry that with how do we hold or how do we help students become accountable for their own learning? And that is the whole strategy instruction piece, and I have the link to that strategy instruction text. But once we teach students strategies, and we teach them to use a checklist, or we teach them to teach them the strategy, we teach them to actually self-monitor their own learning, and that's the executive function. This is where I have repeatedly had people say to me, well, you don't understand. If I teach students to learn strategies and I teach them to monitor their own learning, they won't need me anymore, and then I'll be out of a job. And I said, well, that will never in a million years happen, because there will always be students with disabilities popping up. It's like a tissue box. When one subset of students moves on, because you've done a really great job, another subset will fill that spot. There are always students needing to be taught. So your job is to make students independent of you so they can go away so somebody else can fill that spot. So our job is actually to teach students to monitor their own learning, and you do that through good corrective feedback and strategy instruction. And then the question, I think that leads back to the question of, are there specific strategies? That's a two-part question. The first part is there's generic strategy instruction, so there's just generic good strategy instruction that's explicit. So we model good strategies, and then we pinpoint what strategies do my students need to learn. So I would always say my students need writing instruction. So when I was on sabbatical last year, the whole building, we pinpointed writing instruction. And I had lots and lots of teachers just teaching writing, and that's where we started. Writing, 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 writing. And then when we got pretty good with writing, then we went into reading comprehension, but we didn't do that until we really felt like we got the writing more under control. So we pick a place to start, and we do a really good job with that instruction and getting the students maybe not to mastery, but we get them to where they can be competent enough to work in small groups or work in smaller groups so that I can then start teaching another strategy. And then, then I can move on, but I start with writing and then I go to reading. If you are working with teachers, and I have not seen these videos yet, our library is in possession of them. I just haven't gone to look at them. Anita Archer has apparently a bajillion more explicit instruction videos, and they're on Guilford along with her text. I don't know if they're good. I don't know if they're bad. But if you're working with teachers who need lots and lots and lots of examples of explicit instruction, those are more than are on the website for free. So I can say that. Let me go to the next one. Are there any more questions about strategies or that executive function? Because I think we could talk about that for a long time. No questions about strategies?
No questions in the chat box, Dee.
No? Okay, good. All right. I was worried that I put myself on mute by accident. Okay, so how does the use of protocols? So I'm going on with that. The key is not only working with teachers and getting them to teach strategies, because I guarantee you can do that. The second piece, and this is the piece that's important to students, and this is what I started to talk about, is getting them to self-monitor and own the strategy. And there's a two-pronged piece to this self-ownership. The first piece is collecting the data, and that's where the teachers have to collect the data, and did the students actually do the steps? So if you were to look in that strategy instruction text, there are tons of strategies. They all have steps. Did the student do step number 1 independently, step number 2, step number 3, whatever, step number 7? And then deciding, do I need to go back and do another we-do? Does the student need more practice? Is this student still requiring prompting? And then giving the student his or her own, basically, checklist, data collection sheet. Some students need a more, I'm trying to think of the right word, not a graph, but a self-monitoring sheet that might be, I've used bar graphs, I've used like a rocket ship, and then there are parts to the rocket ship, and for every step of the strategy that they complete, they can color in a rocket ship. I had a student this semester use race cars. I've had people use ice cream cones, all different kinds of things, and the students color it in. And then every time they do the strategy, they have to self-monitor. How many steps did they do independently by themselves that were correct? How many did I do by myself? How many did I do by myself? And that's part of the ownership. And that is how we get students to develop those executive function skills and become independent in strategic thinking. The key with that is that it doesn't happen overnight. And I have found in working in classrooms that sometimes people get really impatient and they want it to happen in 2 weeks, and it doesn't happen in 2 weeks. It happens in 2 months, or it happens in 3 months. I was just talking about reciprocal teaching yesterday with a teacher, and because I'm going to be modeling it in her class next week. And she said, oh, good, so they'll be doing it by themselves in a couple of weeks. I said, they won't be doing it by themselves. No. You'll still be guiding the groups through the end of the school year. There's no way they'll be doing it by themselves before the end of the school year. It's almost the end of May. You can't expect that with strategy instruction. It takes a long time. So when you're working with teachers and you're talking about all of this, developing this strategic thinking, getting students independent, you have to start right in the beginning saying, if students had these skills, they wouldn't need you to teach it to them. And it takes a long time for them to get it. They don't know that we already have it. That's why we're teaching it to them, and they need you to model it and think it aloud, and then they need to monitor it. That's why we give them the self-monitoring checklists and graphs to do and all of those things. But it's really important to set up front. It takes a long time to get them to be able to do that. It's not an overnight fix. And self-monitoring works for everything. It works for reading comprehension. It works for writing. It works for math problem solving. It works for how many sight words kids read. It works for behavior. It works for everything. I had students doing it for repeated reading, so I know it works for just about everything. This is an example of a data sheet that a teacher could use. And if you look at the bottom, the plus means the student did it all by himself, so the teacher didn't have to give a hint. The H means I had to give a hint. So remember, think about step 2. And then corrective feedback means I had to actually model the step. So I had to say the step and then do it, and then have the student repeat it. And then this is the part, whenever you're working in classrooms, this is the part that I have the hardest time getting people to do. I can get them to collect data. I can get them to do the strategies. I can get people to do those sheets on the last page. What I have a really hard time getting people to do is actually take the data for a student and put it on a graph. And even when I can get people to put it on a graph, I have a really hard time getting them to actually look at the graph and then make an instructional decision. And we know that when we get people to look at data on a graph and make an instructional decision, especially for students with disabilities, they will do much better. So I know that if I look at the graph and I see a flat trend, or I see 4 data points in a row, so I see that the student got 1 step, 1 step, 1 step, 1 step, and only got 1 step, that tells me that this strategy isn't working. I maybe need to teach a different strategy. And that's what you're trying to get teachers to see, is that if it's not working, it's not working, and I need to change my instruction. Continuing to go at it for another month probably isn't going to help. If it's starting to go up, maybe I can keep at it for another couple of days. But I can't keep going and have a flat trend, or I can't keep going and have a downward trend. I'm assuming that makes sense. Are there any questions about the graphing? And there are tons and tons of resources on that. Any questions about the graphing? No? Okay. So I am going to go to this link, I hope. And if it doesn't work, I'll just go out of the PowerPoint. Nope. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Kelly, can you still see my screen?
Yes, I see the IRIS resource locator page.
Yay! Okay, good. All right, so this is the best resource on earth. So let's say I'm working with a group of teachers and I wanted to do something with learning strategies. I could go to the resource locator and I go to learning strategies, and I see that there are 17 modules. Well, the place I would start, and this is referenced in your PowerPoint, the place I would start is Evidence-Based Practices Part 1. And the reason I would start there is because this tutorial talks about evidence-based practices, what are they, how do I select an evidence-based practice or program. I have to wait for her. Okay. So basically, these are, and I won't go through these. I won't go through the whole thing because it takes about an hour. Basically, all of them have a challenge. So you watch a little video, and then it'll give you a challenge, and there are questions that you need to answer. And then you go through, and there are little vignettes, or there are expert opinions. So there, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to get to the next one. So this one talks about this is what you're going to learn. I want to get to the part where it has Brian Cook. So this is a lot to read, but it talks about what is an evidence-based practice. This is how you know what it is. This is an evidence-based practice. This is a promising practice. This is a research practice. This is an emerging practice. So when I'm working with teachers and I'm trying to get them to understand, I'm telling you to use reciprocal teaching, because reciprocal teaching is an evidence-based practice. This is why. And you're trying to get them to understand we have to use evidence-based practices because that's what IDEA says we have to use. You're using that as your evidence. So I like to use these or give them to administrators who are using PLCs, and they need topics for their after-school learning communities because it's a nice tutorial, and then you can have conversations. And there are a ton. There's Evidence-Based Practices 1, Part 2, Part 3. There's Collaborative Strategic Reading, which is a reading comprehension strategy that's based on reciprocal teaching. There's writing performance. I don't know if you're familiar with PALS. PALS is a peer tutoring program that was developed at Vanderbilt. These are all the, basically it overviews PALS. It's very powerful tutoring, more powerful at the elementary level than the secondary level. If you're working with people who are doing RTI, there's a 3-part RTI series. There's one about general strategy instruction. So let's say you're working on case studies with teachers. There are case studies, at least for this, on written expression, fluency, reading, comprehension, and vocabulary, and then there's Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. So if you happen to be working just particularly with math teachers, those are really helpful just for math teachers. The activities are okay, but if you happen to be working with teachers on graphic organizers, I know what I wanted to show you in this. Sorry. The thing that's great about these case studies, if you are using them in a professional development, I need to wait for this to catch up with me, is at the end of every case study, probably making everybody seasick, sorry. At the end of every case study, they have these star sheets, and star sheets are strategies and resources sheets, and on those, they give you a strategy. So this one is planning and organizing strategies for narratives. So they tell you what it is, what the research says, and then they give you the strategies, and then they'll give you an example. So it's really great when you're working with teachers and you use these because they can then see a really concrete, oh, this is what you're talking about. So you're talking about strategy instruction. This is a strategy I could use in my classroom. This is a concrete application. Here's another one. So I like these. I really like these case studies because they've basically done the work for you. And then these information briefs, when you're working with teachers, I just look through these. I'm trying to think of one of the ones that's really good. This one. So this is the Division for Learning Disabilities of CEC puts out current practice alerts. And this one talks about self-regulated strategy development, and they have green and they have yellow. Green is go for it, means you should do it. Yellow is use with caution. So if I'm working with teachers and I want them to use self-regulated strategy development, which is the umbrella for one of the umbrellas for strategy instruction, and I really just want to give them a little handout on what is it, I can have them do the tutorial on the IRIS module, but I can also give them this handout because it explains it nicely and it talks about the research. So there's that. That was the very quick tour. And as you can see, there's so much in here. Last semester, I taught behavior management. There were tons of things on here for behavior management about developing a comprehensive behavior plan, how to teach rules. There were activities on here for, I think this was the one. There were activities on here for, these were doing latency and duration recording and frequency and interval recording. So it had actual activities on how to do those kinds of behavior recording. So it had videos of children in a classroom, and it had the behavior recording forms, and then you would sit and watch the video, and you would either do the duration or the latency recording or the frequency and interval recording, and it was really good practice. So for people who've never done it before or people who need a little refresher, those were really nice activities for people to be able to do. And what people found out was that it wasn't exactly as easy as they thought it would be. So are there any questions about this per se? Uh-oh. No? I'm afraid to close it.
Not so much questions as just recognizing the number of resources that are there is amazing.
So, Sophie, while you're on the line, are people familiar with the What Works Clearinghouse? Because I'll do that while I'm on. Yes? Was that a yes?
Yeah, but let's
What Works Clearinghouse. So I'll go to that really quick just because. And you could, just like the IRIS site, you could be on here for hours and hours. And hours and forever. Of course, it looks like it's taking forever to come up. But so the What Works Clearinghouse, if you're not familiar with it, is where they, it's funded by the Department of Education, and it's where they sort of filter through all the research that's been done, and they vet kind of this is an effective practice, this is not an effective practice, and then they and practices, and it's really helpful in sort of helping you as you're working in schools, as you go in and you say, well, this is a really effective practice, and here's the evidence. So one of the ones, that I've been harping on is students, especially students with disabilities, need 10 minutes of fluency practice in math every single day. And I won't get off my high horse about that one. And they just need 10 minutes of fluency practice every day. And if you want them to become good problem solvers, they just practice, practice, practice. So there are practice guides. So if I wanted to know about teaching strategies for algebra in middle and high school students, so if I just want to know the recommendations and I don't want to read the guide, using solved problems to engage students, the level of evidence is minimal. Teaching students to utilize the structure of algebraic representations, minimal. Teaching students to intentionally choose from alternative strategies, moderate. So I know, that's not great for math. Let's say teaching math to young children. Teaching number and operations using developmental progression, moderate, and then look at the rest of these are minimal. Teach geometry, patterns, measurement, and data analysis using developmental progression, minimal. Use progress monitoring to ensure math instruction builds, minimal. Teach children to view and describe their world mathematically, minimal. Dedicate each time each day to teaching math and integrate math instruction throughout the school day, minimal. So now I look at that and I say, oh my gosh, does that mean I shouldn't teach math every day? That sounds wacky. Then I go and look at the practice guide and I say, well, what does it say? How are they telling me I should really teach math? Teaching elementary students to be effective writers. Provide daily time for students to write. Okay, that makes me have a fatal heart attack. Teach students to use the writing process for a variety of purposes. That says you should teach the writing process. So that's all pre-writing, writing. Teach students to become fluent with handwriting, spelling, sentence construction, typing, moderate. Create an engaged community of writers. So I would look at that and I would say, well, I want to know more about this because provide daily time for students to write. I can't believe they're telling me don't have students write every day. And then I would go click, write on the report, and I would see what they have to say. So this, like the Vanderbilt website, is a wealth of information. The intervention guides, let me go back so you can see where I was. Sorry. The intervention reports are very specific interventions. So if I wanted to find out about open court reading, I would go click on open court reading. And then I would see what does it say. If I wanted to look at reading recovery, I would go look at reading recovery. Some of the programs that you might be interested in, you might find them listed here, but it says not yet studied. So are there any questions about that? This is another one of those I get on there. I'm like, oh, that was really interesting. That was really interesting. And then I just end up looking at 15 different reports, and I forgot why I went there in the first place. Any questions about that? I'm hoping. Oh, good. I was worried. I just kicked myself out. All right. Where we were. Okay, there. That's where we were. Any questions about those? And you can really spend days on those websites. And the Vanderbilt, I'm pointing at, like you can see, the Vanderbilt website allows you to sign up, and you can get an account on there and sign up as a professional developer. So you can go on there and get an account, and then you'll get emails from them. And that also allows you to access some of the answer keys that they have. So if you wanted to use some of their materials as professional development materials, you can do that. Finally, questions, comments?
Well, Dee, I have a comment. This is Marie Brander. I just think in terms of the Iris Center and really spending time there, I think that's going to be an incredible resource for me, just in terms of really developing background knowledge and also having some great resources. I think also the way in which you described looking through and going back in terms of the strands within the standards to look at, what is the strand or the theme throughout and how do you bridge the gap. Doing that process, I think, will be really helpful as well. I may have questions as I review this. Is there a format? Can we email you if we have a specific question about today's, webinar?
Yes.
That comes up? Okay.
Yes, and we forgot to say that up front. Even if you have a question in 3 months, feel free to email me.
Right, because I think for me it was taking a lot of it in, and I may need to digest it, think about it in the context of our work and also statewide. So I may be emailing you.
That's fine. If it makes you feel any better, I earned my doctorate over 20 years ago, and I still email those people and ask questions. So,
right.
So, you never stop. I never stop asking questions.
Yes.
So even if it's, 6 months, a year, it doesn't really, I'll always answer questions.
Great.
And it is a lot to digest. And as I said, I normally teach this course in 2 semesters. So I'm throwing it's kind of like spray and pray, I guess. I'm just throwing everything at you that I can in 2 hours.
No, but I think in terms of really thinking through those common threads, going back, doing backward chaining, as well as really focusing on the problem-solving strategies and the vocabulary. I just have to put it in context with everything else we've been thinking on this topic. I'll certainly email you.
Okay.
Sophie,
Marianne.
I think one of the things we were planning to do at our meeting next week was to talk about the webinar now that everybody's had a chance to participate. Can we kind of process it a little bit? So maybe to make Dee's life a little bit easier, what we could do as a result of that activity is designate a point person who can contact Dee so she doesn't have all 17 RSETs crying, on her phone line. We can give her one person who can be a point of contact, or maybe a couple of different people. But I think we can work on that next week.
That's a good idea.
Marianne, if I could just request, you touched on early in the PowerPoint the issue of the multi-grade classes or the multi-age, especially our special classes, and most of our teachers are concerned about the issue of addressing the Common Core across 3 grade levels. What do you do with the curriculum? And you provided some very general ideas or recommendations. If you could provide Kelly with some resources or maybe some specifics around lesson plans, because our teachers are really struggling with that whole concept of 3 grade levels, very needy students, significant differences in reading levels, etc. I'm sure you recognize what those challenges may be within that special class. But if you could identify additional resources, or again, I know Iris may even have some additional resources there as well. You touched on it, as you said, pray and pray.
Right, and so this
is a big issue.
This is what I ended up doing last year in that kind of second, third, and fourth grade class, because this poor teacher, it was a firecracker of a class. So I spent a lot of time in there. So what we ended up doing, so in math, we would look at the modules and we would say, okay, it looks like area is taught in all three. So we will do a group lesson on area, and then we will break into centers. And she was lucky that she had a TA, so she had at least another body in her room. So she essentially did centers, and she would then do grade level centers. And so we do large group instruction on area, so a general area lesson. And then she would see the TA would have a group, she would have a group, and then there'd kind of be an independent practice little group. And then the groups would rotate. And that's also what we did for ELA. We would do a large group writing lesson, and then she would have small, she would do, I hesitate to call it centers because it really wasn't even centers because she only had 3. She would try to structure then what was ever in that grade level module as appropriate for that grade level, because they were directed that they had to work in the modules and they had to work in whatever grade level module the children were in. So she had second, third, and fourth graders. She had to be doing the second grade domains, which are so completely different than the modules. So, we piecemealed, we band-aided some things together for her. And in the end, it cobbled enough to work. And I do think her students did learn. Believe me, I have no idea how they learned. This is one thing I would throw out to you and to the teachers that you're working with. If there is a college or university nearby, we are all required to do field work. We have field work requirements, pre-student teaching field work requirements that our candidates have to do. See if you can get that college or university to bring field work students out. Because one of the things I did last year, because I was on site, basically ordered the people who were teaching my class in my absence to bring our teacher candidates to my school, and I made them go into the needs class. So I basically structured extra help in those classes. So if you're working in communities where there might be a college or university and you can get some extra help from undergraduate or graduate students, I would get your teachers to reach out and try and do that. It's at least a tiny Band-Aid. It's not.
I know they're doing that. Because they're linking with SUNY Fredonia.
Okay.
So I
and
know
SUNY Fredonia is awesome.
Yes.
They have an awesome program and they're really good. But I had teachers begging me to come back this year, which I did, and they're also begging for my colleagues because I think they felt like it was just that extra little teeny Band-Aid. And then because we know the lay of the land and we know the strategies, and it kind of helped a lot. But we tried, I guess, the strategy we found worked at least enough. And it wasn't optimal, was we did large group instruction and then we did centers. And that's what some of the general ed teachers in the primary grades are doing this year, because they found it was the only way they could manage the multi-levels, because certainly there are students who have not been identified yet. So they have second graders who don't know all the letters of the alphabet. You're in schools. So that's really what they've tried to do. They're doing their domain instruction, and then they're going into centers so that they can try and reach everybody's needs. So that's how we tried to Band-Aid it last year, at least in ELA and math. And the self-contained teacher, for the readings, she did a lot of YouTubing and found as many books as possible on YouTube. And the students did like that. Right. It was more exciting than her reading them all the time, I guess.
Dee, Do you mind if I ask you a question in terms of this topic in this webinar and thinking through some of the materials that we're using and the guidance in the June 2014 field memo on the role of the CSE and the Common Core? In materials that Pat Geary has produced or in those memos, they talk about really thinking through the 5 areas where a student may have barriers such as material, environment, etc., and thinking through accommodations and supports such as books in digital format, etc. How do you find that area of focus to fit with this area?
I need to think through. I have a question. I need to think it through before it comes out.
So thinking through the student who obviously has when you're thinking through the gap analysis and you see that there's a discrepancy between the grade level, the student's ability in terms of his reading level, the content, that in that, say, 5th grade, that student's reading maybe on a 2nd grade level, yet he or she's going to be part of a protocol group to discuss a text. Using books in a digital format or other strategies or supports and accommodations. In your work, do you address those topics as well as part of SDI?
Do you mean in our scaffolds and in things? I do.
Yeah.
So yes, we have. As a matter of fact, one of my scaffolds was actually YouTube videos. It was in 6th grade, Dragon Wings. Lawrence, yes, it was. So we did put those in there, and some of them were even things like sentence starters, icons on worksheets. Some of them in math were teaching using the concrete representational abstract, because in math, I don't want to use the word a lot. Some of the instruction assumes some background knowledge, and it starts at the abstract level. So there are certainly students who need it to start at the concrete level with manipulatives. So we have put that into the scaffolds. One of the things we also put in nauseam was explicit vocabulary instruction. Our team has made the argument that there are, and it's not only students with disabilities. I work a lot. Mount St. Mary College is in Newburgh. I was on sabbatical in Newburgh. There are, typical old general ed students who do not have good background knowledge, because by virtue of where they live, and just that's it. They just don't have good background knowledge. So we have put a lot of explicit vocabulary instruction in there because we have said it's not only students with disabilities who don't have, I was in school at the beginning of last year, and there were students who had to do that 3rd grade I notice, I wonder. They didn't even know what that meant.
Right.
They just they didn't even know what it meant. And this was general ed. There were certainly some students with disabilities in the class, but this was general ed class, and I had teachers coming to me after school. They're like, that was a disaster. And I said, I know it was a disaster. Tell me, why was it a disaster? They said, they don't even know what it means to wonder. What do you mean? I noticed. They don't even know what it means to know. So we've tried to scaffold those things in there. To me as a special ed teacher, I look at that and I say, well, of course that's a scaffold. Of course you would do a sentence starter. Of course you would put, of course you would do that. There are some general ed teachers who would look at that and they'd say, why would you even put that in there? But, we are continuing to make the argument there are all sorts of students in general ed classes. There are students, and I'll throw myself under the bus. There are students in self-contained classes and, special classes who are being forced to use the modules, and if they're going to be forced to use them, they need to have access to them. So some of our scaffolds we are writing assuming that teachers of students with disabilities are using the modules. So that's how we're writing them. I'm not sure that that'll make it into the final version, but we are writing it and presenting it that way.
Great.
So I don't know, I might get kicked out of the state of New York one day, but that's okay. So yes, we are trying that. And if there are any other scaffolds, so if you're working in a school and you say, because now I'm certainly well familiar with the modules. If you're working in a school and you say, I'm working on the narrative of Frederick Douglass and I need a scaffold, can you please help me? Certainly email me, and I will help you come up with a scaffold.
Great.
Or, you're reading, and if I can't think of it, I now have enough people on my team. One of us will come up with something for you.
Great. Yeah.
Sure. Any more questions? Comments?
Sophie, I think I'll just say thank you very much, Dee, for agreeing to do this a second time. I know you've spent a lot of time trying to help our group, and I really appreciate the extra time you took for those of us who couldn't make it the first time to do this the second time. So thank you very much.
Not a problem at all. I was glad to do it. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.
I'm sure we will.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you all.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Well,
Question, Kelly?
no, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating and to thank you as well, Dee, as Sophie did, for agreeing to do this a second time around. We now have a full recording, and we'll be sure to share that with folks. There will be a few materials that I'll send to Sophie, which she can send out to the group. And when we have the recording available on the website, I will let you know as well. And finally, there will be a feedback form, a webinar feedback form that I will send to Sophie, an online link. And we are always interested in your feedback and response to the webinar. So thank you again, and have a nice afternoon.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.